All right, Chelsea fans, welcome back to another episode. That's right, of the London is Blue podcast. Hope for your favorite Chelsea podcasts out there and a part of the Men in Blazers Media Network. It's Sam, CFC Central, and Nick joining me for an episode that's a little bit of a special edition. This one is one that the people have requested, that we've talked about a little bit, but it's taking a look at the wholesale work that Chelsea Football Club have done since the June 2022 transfer window. That'd be when Clearlake had finalized their takeover and started taking over full control of footballing operations through this most recent transfer window, the winter 2025 transfer window, and really trying to answer the question of just, have we gotten better? And I think there's going to be a lot of data to support that maybe we have not in that regard. And talk about, I think really structurally, Nick, we're going to get into three kind of very specific buckets. One is just, how did we get here? We want to set the stage for the history of the decisions that the ownership group and then the sporting directors have made to put us here. We did do a survey of listeners to understand their thoughts, and we're going to get into a window by window examination, taking a look at the pros and cons of those windows. And then we're going to take that future look ahead, looking at summer 2025, looking ahead at just maybe the overall trust or faith or lack of faith people have in the actual organization at the moment, and assessing where the squad is and, you know, what positions really we need to kind of build in to get there. But I know we've talked about this one for a little bit. Maybe to set the stage, when you went back and looked at it in totality, what was the feeling you had?
I mean, I think
sigh.
This whole thing is really just like you rewind your brain to March of 2022, right? The Ukraine war had just started, and there was a lot of uncertainty about what was going to happen with the club. I remember that I was on the way down to see my dad in Florida, and I was about to board a plane when the news came out that Roman was going to sell the club. And then we went through 2.5 months of Love Island, but with billionaires trying to buy Chelsea Football Club and make their pitch and try and win us over with different, you know, things that we might find attractive. And I think if everyone is honest, the Bully Clearlake bid was by far the most preferred bid amongst the groups. I mean, you look back at the statements from the Chelsea Supporters Trust at the time, the Chelsea pitch owners, you look at just fan groups and podcasts across the ecosystem. And I think if everyone is honest, given the incredibly tight window of sale and the bidders that were available, this was by far the most attractive option to everybody. And, you know, I think it's important to put that into context because, you know, you can look at it now and there are great owners in different sports doing great things. And I think, you know, in particular, the owner of Bournemouth is doing a fantastic job with the resources that they had available and the talent that they've been able to build into their squad. We were in a much different place, right? So I think to look at it in a current lens is maybe not doing the situation that we were in justice. And so, like you said, this is going to we're going to just strip it down to the bare bones of what has happened, try and be as scientific as we can about, you know, the point of reference that we have, and then try and figure out if this is going to work or not. And that is the kind of the emphasis for this episode.
Yeah, and so maybe as we kind of start to set the stage, just looking at it, you know, we talked about it, May 2022 is when the Clearlake takeover was finalized. And then Sam, like, we got really quick hits in October on some of the additions that Chelsea were going to make in the sporting director technical positions. First was that Lawrence Stewart was announced as a technical director focusing on football globally, if you want to look at a little bit of a word salad there. And then Joe Shields announced as a co-director of recruitment and talent. And those were the first two announcements that happened in October 2022. How was your feeling, or what was your feeling, maybe just to kind of pull yourself back to that moment about these appointments in particular, knowing that, you know, Joe Shields had his pedigree from Man City and at the time had kind of just recently accepted a job at Southampton. And then we know that, you know, Lawrence Stewart, you know, obviously had his, you know, time at Monaco, and there were some young players that had progressed through that club that we felt pretty good about at the way that they were progressing. And so, I do think most of those at the time were generally viewed as favorable appointments in terms of what they might bring to the larger Chelsea technical footballing, ID and knowledge that was missing from that first summer window where you had Todd Bowley, Badad, and others involved in making those decisions on who Chelsea would or wouldn't sign.
Yeah, I mean, when I hark back to when it all happened, we obviously were in a moment of chaos. There was a lot of murkiness in terms of what's going to happen because the future was quite uncertain. But I can't really fault any of the appointments. I think they covered all their bases in terms of picking out two, three really, really good industry professionals who had done very well. They also were pretty clear on the fact that they would want a sister club. They would want to try and go out and maybe develop, another offshoot where they could develop talent and find and nurture maybe those guys that are not ready to take a direct step up. So, which is why Christopher Vivell also came in, who had done some really, really good work. And again, Lawrence Stewart is somebody that I heard on a couple of platforms on a podcast. He had some wonderful things to say. So overall, it felt quite optimistic. But I remember that first preseason that happened with Thomas Tuchel, and I came out of it thinking, my word, the wheels are falling off already. And when we got spanked by Arsenal in that preseason friendly, the Billy Gilmore incident, Mason Mount having to interfere, you could tell that with, Thomas Tuchel's professional, personal life also going through a very, very turbulent time. It was extremely tough on him. So it's just everything that could go bad went bad in that moment. That's the least amount of things that you need when you're sort of taking over a new club. Like look at Arne Slot, look at his sort of environment. He's come in, he's got the same ownership, he's got the same core players, and all he has to do is just continue to build on it. For us, it was completely different. We had to buy three new players, then the manager switched. We had to change the entire sporting structure. We had to redevelop a vision for the future. So it's hard. I empathize and I have a lot of sympathy in terms of how it could have gone versus how it has gone. But I think we could have ended up with far worse owners. Is my sort of predicament at this time.
Dan, I think back to one of the great sliding doors moments, and this was in Vegas. We were on our way to our first live show in Vegas, and we were talking with Naz, and he was telling us, because we split an Uber to the other side of the strip. He was like, man, and it was pretty public at the time that Chelsea were chasing Michael Edwards of Liverpool, who had kind of decided to take a break from football. And, like this was the preeminent sort of, director of football sort of profile in the league that was available. And Bowley really wanted him apparently. And they were, they were throwing insane money at him. And it was, he was the guy. And so we went from the guy to a bunch of guys trying to do one job. And there's an old phrase in the NFL, if you have two quarterbacks, you don't have one. And that's kind of, I think, maybe where the model shifted, was that sliding doors moment of do you want to put your faith in one person?
Yeah.
Who has a record and a history of doing really good stuff? Or do you want to build a team of people who can split responsibilities, add unique perspectives, and try and cobble together a sporting director out of many different, sorts of patches. And that is, I think, where we are today, which is like there are different specialties within the whole group. You can kind of, we go through the list, but that was a big sliding doors moment that I will always think back on was Naz talking about Michael Edwards and what that would mean for Chelsea.
Well, we did progress with the idea of Groupthink FC, and at least at the technical level, because in November and December, there was the mention that, Sam made about the fact that Christopher Vivell, he came or was appointed in December 2022 as a technical director. And then right before that in November, we got the news that Paul Winstanley was going to join as the director of global talent and transfers for Chelsea Football Club. And he started immediately. He was the only one out of that grouping.
Can we call out just like Stewart announced as technical director focusing on football globally? And then Winstanley again, his title?
Director of Global Talent and Transfers.
Fantastic.
Very
Okay.
Office Space in terms of the names that they were given.
That assistant to the regional manager sort of thing happening here.
I mean, it's kind of, I mean, I work in an advertising agency and all of our titles are bullshit, but like those two together, it's just like the Siamese twins of football global transfers. Like that's kind of where we're at.
Well, we did find some humor in this episode, so I'm glad that we got there eventually. So really the only one in the winter 2023 window that got involved very early on was Paul Winstanley joining in November 2022, because Shields in January 2023 did start because Chelsea actually went and paid money to Southampton to reduce down the time of his gardening leave so that he could get started at the very, very, very near the end of the window there. And then it wasn't until February when Stewart comes in. He's confirmed as a co-sporting director with Winstanley, so they decided to change the titles again. And then in July of 2023, Vivell left Chelsea. He had been on an indefinite gardening leave. And that kind of leaves us with where our recruitment and talent and sporting directors and global think tank organizations have landed us. We have co-sporting directors in Paul Winstanley and Lawrence Stewart. We have Joe Shields evolved as a recruitment and talent advisor for the organization. And that's kind of the grouping that we have at this moment. And so, I think there were some quotes too that when they kind of came together and when they got announced, particularly Lawrence Stewart and Paul Winstanley, the club put out an article indicating what that meant. Because I think we need to just establish, like, what does it mean to be a co-sporting director at Chelsea Football Club? Because some clubs have different meanings for it, and the definition can be different based upon your understanding of the game. The way that it says on the website to set the criteria for how we should evaluate them is they oversee the entire sporting team comprising talent, scouting, recruitment, and data. When Stanley joined in November last year and oversaw Chelsea's January transfer strategy alongside the board, Stewart joins the club next week from AS Monaco, where he was the technical director. They work closely with Graham Potter, throwback, and his coaching team to support the men's first team. And that team at the time included Christopher Vivell, Joe Shields, Kai McCauley, and Jim Frazier leading the talent and management recruitment team, and then Matthew Hallam leading data and analysis. The team's focus will be ensuring Chelsea is competitive and sustainable on the pitch, investing in the growth of the sporting department team to identify, nurture, and develop talent over the long term with a modern data-driven philosophy. Look, ChatGPT might have not been as popular at the time, but it definitely feels, Nick, like we funneled in a couple of data points to the model there, the large language model, and we got out an article that gives us a lot of generalities for what they should be going out to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's help win. It would have been an easier, more succinct way of putting that. I mean, like talent scouting, recruitment, and data is the job. Now, I think as we get into the quotes from the ownership, from when they first bought the club, what becomes pretty apparent early on in this process is that Chelsea, the new Chelsea ownership, looked at the old Chelsea ownership as outdated, not data savvy enough, and like there were tons of opportunities to optimize the way that decisions were made and the kind of thought process and ways that scouting could be different, because I mean, be honest, it wasn't all hits during the Roman Abramovich era in terms of transfers. There were quite a few misses as well.
You're going to bring out the Poppy one already off the top there? Come on.
Jill Boji was a legend, and I won't hear another word about it. But I do think the mindset at the time was, holy shit, we're going to get smarter. We're going to start operating not only just in like the current facet of like, how do we, take one window at a time and get better, but like the model is going to extend past. We're going to start doing business 2-3 windows in advance. We're going to start scouting earlier and earlier so that we don't have to spend 100 million pounds on a player. We've already scouted him and he's already part of the system. And, it's a person we can bring in for free. And that's why you're going to hear sustainability a lot as we go through these quotes. I think that was the mindset that we had at the time, which is how do we get smarter? How do we have a competitive advantage? Even though we have a billionaire ownership group, how do we get better?
And Sam, so I think this is kind of then the appropriate stage to set, what were the expectations that Todd Bowley and Badad set out for and have externalized to the public. Because again, billionaires don't talk often in public. They don't give you necessarily a ton of information to understand maybe how they're thinking or where they want to take the team. We'll read the Todd Bowley quote, and then I'll kind of skim. We can kind of then skim some of the thoughts that Badad had, if you had in particular. But Bowley's quote, and this was after the purchase, after the acquisition, saying that we were honored to become the new custodians of Chelsea Football Club. We're all in 100%, every minute of every match. Your players might not agree. Our vision as owners is clear. We want to make the fans proud, along with our commitment to developing the youth squad and acquiring the best talent. Our plan of action is to invest in the club for the long term and build on Chelsea's remarkable history of success. And then there was a bunch of quotes from Badad late December 2022. He talked about the valuation of teams. He talked about how your asset, and there was like how European sports are 20 years behind the US in sophistication on the commercial side and the sophistication on the data side. I don't want to say that they have egg on their face, but I don't think that these objectives are necessarily being met with the trajectory that the club is currently on. And I don't think these statements necessarily paint them as truly understanding the work that was going to be required to bring Chelsea to the level to be as competitive as they need to be in the Premier League and in European competition.
In particular, Sam, the not terribly well run quote gets trotted out quite frequently, but there's also we think there's a path to controlling labor costs and still producing a winning product using data and the multi-club model. We still think the multi-club is an interesting tool for player trading. And if you have a cost structure that can sustain you and invigorate the fan base, we think you can have a business that makes money, that are natural monopolies in their markets without the regulation, without the salary caps. The context there being of American sports. So that's where they're starting from, which is a huge departure from the Roman Abramovich trust. I will just spend whatever it takes to win model.
Well, I mean, the part that sticks out to me more is the 4-4-3, because that's sort of earmarked where it might go. And you sort of said that there's going to be a lot of talk about how we're smarter, but when we did our first business, all I could hear was the background track go, "Viva Las Vegas," and then somebody's flying off to like sign Raheem Sterling, sign Kalidou Koulibaly, sign all these big guys on sort of premium wages in towards like the peak of their contract careers, and sort of moving towards a big payday. And I think that was just to appease Thomas Tuchel also, to sort of say, okay, what is your immediate need? This is what is going to happen. And maybe then once your manager's a little happy in terms of your squad strength, then you start working towards, the next 2 windows or 3 windows, however it is that a technical director sort of talks about his role, which is to plan in the future. But to give them credit, there were a lot of novel things that they did. We talked about amortization, which was for the longest time our favorite word on the pod, and how they were able to sort of circumnavigate those loopholes for which the Premier League had to sort of step in and close it down. So they're not dumb guys. They're genuinely smart guys who tried to find ways to sort of make us financially stable at a time where, a lot of questions were being asked. So a lot of good and bad sort of came through with that first 6 months of the ownership. I would say the first part of the deals that they were trying to make. But I was hoping that it would sort of, the structure would figure itself out. Like you said, maybe too many cooks in the end. You ideally wanted one technical director to take care of everything outside the club in terms of how Strasbourg are working. Do we have a Portuguese club? Do we have a Brazilian club? How are those guys playing? The sporting directors take care of like what Chelsea needs as of this moment. Joe Shields finds those young guys like Palmer or whatever. Like he follows, I don't know how many thousands of footballers from across the world. So he's got an eye on talent in those youth sort of tournaments, and he's scouting there as well. So from a bird's eye view, all of that looked good, but then Vivell suddenly left and all of it, came crashing down. So yeah, chaos, I think, at the end of the day. But that's what my expectation was. I saw smart guys who were sometimes maybe too smart for their own good, and maybe that's how it's continued.
Dan, one quote again from Ed Bali that sticks out from this Sportico article, which was December of 22. So a while ago, over 2 years ago. He's talking about developing talent where you don't have to spend crazy money on payroll. We hired a coach from Brighton, and we think they're one of the best run teams in the Premier League. The owner is from a sport gaming data background, spends 10% of the payroll, wins almost as much, and is very stable, mid-market, mid-table, very profitable club. If you apply some of that IP to developing talent, but keeping your talent, that's obviously a good thing. That is pretty telling now. When you look back at the model, and I think people need to do a little bit of research on what private equity is. They don't get into the game for altruistic reasons. They get into the game to make money. Historically, owning a sports team is not a great way to make money unless you're in a very consolidated NBA, NFL structure that like has a purpose for that. Like the English football game has not historically been the best way to profit.
Well, not when a large portion of the potential prize is predicated on your performance in the league and getting into Europe, which is why we saw the conversations around a Super League in that point in time to lock you into guaranteed revenue on a European level through broadcast rights that would allow you to operate as a top 5, top 10 team in the world every single year with the best possible players and a format that did not necessarily endear itself to the greater sporting community because it flies in opposition for, I think, what we as supporters view as what the game is. And I think the last thing before we start getting into the windows is setting the expectation around the fact that this all came down to being a little bit more fiscally minded in how the club was running and how the club was operating. And we'd seen some of that transformation under Roman Abramovich in the later years. Initially there was some pretty outsized spending when he took over the club in the early 2000s. And so I don't want to set the stage that like he was always going to spend more than anybody else, because in the last, 5, 6, 7 years, it was kind of this one in, one out philosophy. And I was going to bring a player in, I was going to get a player out. And that was the way that we were trying to upgrade the squad in bits and bobs. Now we're in a mode with the profit and sustainability regulations that the Premier League enforces, that there was a view in the fact that, over a 3-year kind of rolling time period, that a club could not lose in excess of 105 million pounds, or they would be eligible for potential penalties in that regard, whether that's a financial penalty or even a sporting penalty relative to lost points or point deductions. We know we've seen that with Everton last season in particular. And some of the accounting that they did or did not produce appropriately. And, that is another kind of additional consideration. There's also European considerations as well. And so all of that factors into the fact it sets the stage for a ownership organization that has a different model and view towards how profits have to be generated. And Chelsea for a long time, not only were making money commercially, but had really become a club dependent on trading players. On some of the deals where like we sold Eden Hazard to Real Madrid, and that was a very, very profitable move for Chelsea Football Club, was paying dividends down the line as they were winning competitions after the fact. And so that has to change a little bit of the expectation here. So as we think about like the expectation for the windows, like we're looking at the windows from June 2022 all the way to this most recent one, winter 2025. And I think we talk about it as, again, June is only a Igbali and, Todd situation in terms of like who had the ownership there. We know that then in that first winter window that you did get when Stanley involved in that one. And then, so that kind of has a consideration there. And then really from the future forward, it was the existing sporting director group of Lawrence Stewart, Paul Stanley, some involvement from Joe Shields. And it's like, you probably get some upward pressure on who you should sign or what your budget is or things of that nature from the ownership group. But really then that's when they truly become accountable to it. And for this, if you want to follow along at home or you're kind of watching on YouTube and you want to pull up another window, all of this is coming from Transfer Market in particular, just to account off of the profit and loss within a particular window and like who got signed and who went where. And so like that's what we're using as the source of truth here. But again, as I mentioned before, Nick, we did run a survey and we had some listeners participate in this to kind of just help us give a baseline for where they view the club to be. And then so we could then kind of balance, like, are we, heading in the right direction? Are we trending the right way that, as podcasters, as we do with the supporters groups, are we aligned? Or are we not necessarily aligned? First question was, how satisfied as a supporter are you of the quality of transfer business? That's a level of players incoming, outgoing since June 2022. And I gave people an option of extremely satisfied, very satisfied, neutral, very dissatisfied, or extremely dissatisfied. What did the listeners opt for?
I don't think it would be like
Shocking.
so let me just say this about the results of this survey. I think if you would have done this in October, and maybe we should revisit this when times are a little better from like a results standpoint, I think you might have different answers than you do today. Chelsea are clearly on a slide as we're recording this on Sunday, February 9th. And I think that does factor into how people think about this, but I think it's still a worthwhile exercise to do, right? 45% very dissatisfied, 26% extremely dissatisfied, a small sliver of very satisfied, and then 26% neutral. No extremely satisfied.
Not surprised there.
No, and look, I again, if you'd have done this in October, it might have been a little bit more balanced, but I still think that people understand that there are some huge swings that were taken, some huge gambles that were made that just simply have not paid off in terms of any real results.
Right. And Sam, as you kind of assess, your own feelings and your view as you look back and assess in the preparation of this podcast, where are you amongst these answers? Are you on the neutral, the very dissatisfied, extremely dissatisfied? I don't think you're going to be the rare or the elusive, extremely satisfied, shiny Pokemon equivalent here. Like, that's just not happening on this episode.
How do you know I didn't vote for it? Huh? I mean, it's anonymous, isn't it? But
That's
I
what you
mean,
think.
I completely take on board what Nick has said, and I would probably be in the neutral territory, purely
Fair,
because
yeah.
I'm also looking at this as an exercise in self-reflection because I've had the privilege of doing almost every single player pod with you, Dan. So we've talked about these players from a strengths and weakness perspective, and it's easy for me to sit here in retrospect and say what a bad deal. But there were certain players that I was genuinely excited for, and some of them we called out. So I'm just looking at this saying, when the squad is good, and like Nick said, if this was early on in the season when we were flying and confidence was high, then you'd probably say that this is a top four side with, maybe the ability to at least challenge the top three because we were in second for the longest time. So maybe it is still there. The magic's around. Maybe we're not fit enough. Maybe something's gone wrong behind the scenes. Those are all answers we don't know. We're not privy to. But from a talent standpoint, in terms of at least a majority of the signings that we've acquired, and even more than that, the amount of failures that we've moved on, I think is really good. To move on Havertz for the fee that we did, to move out Mount for the fee that we did, especially to see how they've gone and done at their, other clubs out there. I feel like we've got a good part of the deal. So I'll
Get
give them credit
Lukaku
for
out
that
of
and
the
say that
club. I'd throw out there too.
yeah, and that was Rock Nation, by the way. I don't think if Kohli was there that would have happened at all because he was more than happy to sit on his hands and see where it goes. But yeah, they did sort of get their outgoings absolutely spot on. And credit to them, when it's not worked, they've been quite ruthless and said, okay, done. Like, let's move it on. We've seen that with Felix also. We've seen that with Vega as well. So they're very quick to say that there's a quick turnaround for us in case it doesn't work. So I'm just sitting here thinking there's still a lot of talent here and we can still make top four and win the Conference League. And it's well placed maybe to kick into gear in the third year if we make like some smart acquisitions down the line.
And Nick, I think you landed in the neutral spot as well. And any other additional reasoning beyond Sam's?
No, I think Sam makes a good point about it's not just about the incomings, it's about the outgoings. Like there were if we are all honest, there was a significant squad turnover that was going to happen at some point because we were at the end of the Abramovich era where I think that squad had just kind of tapped out for better or for worse, right? And I think we had squeezed as much out of them as we could. And obviously, this photo above me, if you're watching on YouTube, was kind of the last remnants of that squad was really that like Real Madrid loss away at the Bernabeu that I think was crushing as the sale was going on and all that sort of stuff. But it kind of felt like that was the natural point of turnover, and I think like it was going to happen regardless. But the pace at which it happened was insane. I don't think we were ready for that because we had kind of done a handful of signings in, a handful of signings out during the Abramovich era, but not like 20, 30 signings all at once, which it felt like. Some of those obviously have been hits, some of those have been misses, but I think I come in neutral. I'm a long way off satisfied, let's be honest, but I don't think I can be in the very or extremely dissatisfied categories either. I think just contextualizing all this, it makes sense to be in the middle.
Yeah, I'm going to shade just a little bit more anti the performance on this and go actually with the very dissatisfied.
You're so negative, Dan.
I
Everyone
know.
knows that.
It's usually
Everyone
when I get
says
called
it.
on this episode.
Yep.
I usually get the 5-star, the 1-star reviews on the podcast usually, and the most negative person on this show.
If only Dan wasn't so negative all the time. Jeez.
I know. The absolute worst. Because I do hear the point you're making on that we have done a lot of outgoing business. And like I think that is something that gets maybe a little lost. But I also think we have sent off players who we could have kept that were better than the replacements that we brought in. I think there have been some, unfortunate spends. And, we would argue that maybe that spend happened to make another move occur on the trading side. And, I think that we're not we're not really stronger than we were at the start of this in terms of being competitive. And we know, and we have to assess that like we were on a little bit of a downward slope with some of the things that were going to happen. I mean, we kind of, as we start to look like you had players like Antonio Rudiger and Andreas Christensen who walked on freeze to leave Chelsea Football Club. And you would argue that we didn't necessarily get better from a center back perspective right away. Like we, would say that we're somewhat better in some areas, but maybe not. Like I think in general that is why I trend more towards a dissatisfied rating versus like a neutral, because I want to say that we're better, and we have like 2 or 3 players that you could argue are trending towards, if not in consideration or conversation for being best in their position in the world level of the game. That's not enough for the type of team Chelsea wants to be and the standard for which the owners have set out and espouse is where Chelsea Football Club should be. And like, that's the reason I would say if I'm applying not necessarily my feeling to it, if I'm applying the standard of the ownership group, we're not at the level we need to be. Maybe on the women's team. The women's team, I would go extremely satisfied with this, but not on the men's first team. So let's start breaking down the windows maybe as kind of a whole here. We'll just talk about like favorites and worst first, but then we'll get specifics. But no surprise, I think that the summer 2023 window with a whopping 89%, which again, you can't get a lot of people to agree on things in life, Nick, at the moment.
Yeah, pretty good.
89% of people felt like that was Chelsea's best transfer window since we've had the new ownership group come in. That was also the Moises Caicedo, Lavia, and Nkunku coming in, Cole Palmer coming in, Nico Jackson coming in. There are also a couple of misses within that one too that we'll get to as we talk about more detail. But that was also the sale of Kai Havertz to Arsenal, the sale of Mason Mount to United, the sale of Kovacic to Manchester City. Getting players out of the club. Like it was, I think this was the ultimate clearing house and trying to reset with improving players in key positions.
It's been their best attempt so far. I think just to be candid, I don't think any other window really even comes close to it. It's a mix of, I think some experienced players, some inexperienced players, but you really are looking at, a couple of really big hits in there that are taking up the average. Not everyone, but, your Nkunkus, your Palmers, your Caicedos, Jackson, I would throw in there like that. It does bring it up compared to where we have been previously. You add in the outgoings to that. And, hypothetically, it's a good window. How it performs is a whole other thing. But, I think just from a incomings, outgoings perspective, by far the best attempt that they've had.
And then, Sam, as we flip to the worst window, here's where people are a little bit more split, but there is a favorite of the group that takes the beating. 31% of people said that the summer 2024 window, the most recent summer window, where we brought in Neto and Felix and Dewsbury Hall as kind of the three biggest spends. And then we sent out a couple players, Ian Motson, Connor Gallagher, Lewis Hall's deal was officially confirmed, and then Lukaku to Napoli as the worst window. Second place one would be the winter 2025 window with a whopping 0 incoming senior players, really, and because we're saying that we're not going to say the 19-year-old midfielder is a senior player at this point in time, even though they made the bench in the most recent game. From an impact signing perspective, and then
that's not us. That's the manager saying that.
That is true. Enzo Maresca himself, and then the summer 2022 window as the third worst. Do you assess or agree on the worst window, or do you have a different view?
Yeah, of course. And I'm very disappointed that Omari Kaliman is not listed as a key incoming because that cost a lot of money, by the way. So, but in general, I think when you're looking from what we had already at the club in terms of Gallagher, pushing him out for Joao Felix, who has been, by all accounts, an absolutely devastating signing in terms of the financial hole that it's burnt in our accounts. Supremely disappointing. We've gifted a top four competitor, a left back who can play central midfield, the exact profile that Enzo Maresca wanted for the next 10 years, probably. He's probably going to be left back for England very, very soon. So, again, for me, that's an utterly disappointing deal. Dewsbury Hall, again, was he required? In my opinion, no. They just looked at the price tag. Maybe, Sadi, Jorginho wiped their hands, said, let's give you a welcome gift. And um, the rest, I really don't know. Like Jorgensen is, again, maybe they looked at the metrics and I'm not aware of it in terms of numbers. And I sort of like stay out of goalkeeper situations as much as I can. That's Brandon's territory. But yeah, in general, like it felt like every single decision that you made weakened the club in some capacity. I think Neto is the only one where I can look at it and say, I can understand the intention, but paying 60 million for him for an injury-prone player who can who's probably sort of thrived in a counter-attacking system and probably not going to be the same way. And probably giving it to Maresca after Pochettino. Like if we were to play it under Poch, I would have been like, that's a pretty good signing. But overall, it just looks like bad business all around. So, in my opinion, the worst window by far.
I would also throw in for honorable mention the winter 2023 window, where you bring in Mudryk for a ridiculous fee. You way overpay for Enzo Fernandez in that window. And it felt like that was the panic window because summer 2022 didn't work out the way that you thought it was going to. And so you went and got your Badia Shields during that window. It was that was the start of like every sporting director goes back to their former club and grabs a person type, system.
Everybody gets one, Nick. Everybody gets one. Unless it's Brighton,
and
then you get to go multiple times.
I just remember how chaos. I mean, we were doing a podcast every fucking day. It felt like during that time, being like, I wonder which former team's player we're going to grab during this win. It was bad. I mean, I remember I was out for an errand and we signed Mudryk, and then we had to like sprint back and get on with the Ukrainian football experts to be like, what the fuck is going on here? And turns out that didn't necessarily work out the way that we had hoped either, but it felt like a panic window. And I would, while I agree with summer 2024 and my loathing of the business that was done last summer, I think that window rivals it in a real way, like more than summer 2022. I think 2022 was a heartfelt good try, and winter 2023 was just panic.
I watched 115 games that month, by the way, leading up to the Jan window, because I was doing the World Cup. I was doing every single player that we got linked to, and I absolutely got jammed. I've never felt that burnt out before.
172.5 hours, in case you're wondering at home.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah,
Wow.
that was Yeah, I was in Abu Dhabi, like sitting outside with my laptop and just watching games day in, day out. It was traumatic to
Oh,
say the least, but
that's when Broya got hurt, right?
yeah, yeah,
That
yeah,
that time period. Yeah.
that's the one. Yeah. So it's just like you said, I tend to look at the first two windows as Hangover Part One and Hangover Part Two, where like somebody went on like a great meal, just buy something like hijack a jet and police saying, overtake that man. And like, somebody sort of takes over Arsenal's jet and gets to Mudryk first. But I think maybe that's just like the sporting directors flexing their muscles to say we're here and take notice. But after that, I think business is sort of maybe evened out a little bit in terms of taking informed guesses by decision makers. But yeah, those two windows are just up there as the worst by far.
All right, so let's start then to talk about the window by window. So we'll break it down. What we'll do is we will go through just the overall like performance that year as well to kind of talk about where the club finished at the end of it all. And we'll then get into what players were sold. We'll do a little bit of reaction or purchased. We'll do a little reaction to the players who were purchased or brought in on a loan. Then we'll also talk about the departures and talk about them a little bit. And we will give our rating. But before that, we'll give the rating of the listeners who gave us some perspective on how they would rate first the summer 2022 transfer window. They gave it in general. Nobody gave it a 5. 5 being the best, 1 being the worst. 43.5% gave it a 2, 32% gave it a 3, and then there were some outliers on the 4 at 10%, and then 1 at 14.5%.
Some generous graders in there. I mean, 3 and a 4. That's not bad.
And this was the season 2022-23 where Chelsea were only in the third round of the League Cup. They went in the quarterfinals in the Champions League. They ended up in the third round of the FA Cup, getting bounced, and then they finished 12th overall in the Premier League. The income from sales. So there were 25 arrivals, departures, and 25 outgoings, like combined between the two. Income was 67.8 million euros, expenditures of 630.25 for a
Slightly
net,
out of balance, Dan. Don't worry about
just
it.
a
It's
little
not a
bit.
big
Elephant
deal.
on the seesaw, mouse on the other side. Negative 562.4 million. I'm going to rip through some of the signings here, and then you can give a reaction to them. So the most expensive transfer of that window was West Fofana coming in at 80.4 million euros, followed by Marc Cucurella at 65.3, Raheem Sterling 56.2, Koulibaly coming in from Napoli 41.2, Chukwuemeka coming in from Aston Villa 18 million, Cassidy coming in from Inter 14.9, Aubameyang coming in from Barcelona, 12 million.
Always forget about Aubameyang, man.
Yeah, you're gonna get some real hits here coming up next. Then Solnina coming in from MLS, 9 million. Zakaria, loan fee of 3 million from Juventus. You had some players coming back like Conor Gallagher, Broya, Levi Colwell. And that's kind of the grouping, I mean, of individuals from a purchase standpoint that came into the side. Thoughts and feelings about that grouping with all the benefit of hindsight that you can have.
It's tough. I mean, I think in particular, I think you go out and get Sterling, right? The guy from Man City had been prolific in his career up to that point, and I think a lot of skeptics were like, "Is how much tread is left on those tires?" He's been playing 50 matches a year since he was 16. So he's, but I think we signed him when he's 27, right? So he's been playing 11 years, tons of football, has won everything there is to win at Man City, except the Champions League, which we stopped him from winning. And, I think was a pretty, I think that summer, that was the marquee signing that you make, right? Like, let's go out and have a statement of intent. Let's go get a bona fide Premier League winger. And if in my own personal grading, all I'm going to do is pass fail, because I think you start to get into numbers and you can start to you can dissect it 50 different ways. Pass fail is a pretty clear indicator. Fafana currently has been a fail. I would say just health. Like he hasn't been available. Maybe not his fault. Uh, Kukurea has been a pass, probably barely, given all the context. Sterling's been a fail. Koulibaly was a fail. Karn's never really got going. Can't even grade that. Same with Cassidy. Aubameyang, fail. Like it's pretty rough reading there, Sam.
I probably have an alternate view on this. In terms of
Ooh,
somebody who's,
bring it.
probably just somebody who's looking at this from a standpoint of what was required at that point. I think we did spend the kind of money that people are begging for us to spend now and saying, go and get bona fide superstars, go and get those proven players. And when you look at the centre backs who are doing really well, Koulibaly had that experience, was a leader at Napoli for the longest time, just a really, really good centre back. So to sort of take a pretty good gamble on him in terms of the money, in terms of Raheem Sterling, somebody who's a proven performer in the Premier League. Wes Fofana, in my opinion, when fit, is one of the best centre backs in the Premier League, without the shadow of a doubt. But it's just we knew that he was coming back from a horrific leg break injury. He was flown to the US to sort of have those medical checks done before we signed him. So diligence was done from that respect, but for one reason or the other, those didn't come off. And I look at Aubameyang as well, and if I had to sign somebody who was a devastating finisher, sort of like in the market for a reasonable amount of fee, was floating around looking for a home, I would have zeroed in on that signing as well. Absolutely. But his home got robbed, a lot of family issues in the background, a lot of things going on in his personal life. He's talked about it pretty openly now. So I look at those circumstances, mitigating circumstances. I'm like, it must have been supremely hard to be in that squad of 34 players and then being left out of the Champions League after doing pretty well against Milan. Uh, it hits you pretty badly. So I then take an alternate view and say a lot of those signings were made with good intentions, but in the chaos that was the 22-23 season, which made me sort of got me perilously close to start drinking. I will probably just say that it's not worked out for one reason or the other. So it happens in transfers all the time, just an unlucky window. Good signings, but didn't work out.
So let's flip then, because we also have the departures of that window too. So we saw Timo Werner leave for 20 million euros to back to Leipzig. You had Emerson leave to West Ham, 15.4. You had Billy Gilmore leave to Brighton, 8.3 million euros. You had Lukaku go out on loan to Inter. You had Mishi leave for 3.5 million.
So funny.
Sar goes out on loan. Just stop. Like I guess we have to laugh to kind of deal through this, but you had Kennedy leave for 500,000.
What is this? The summer of 2015-16? Good Lord.
Come on. You had Rudiger leave on a free transfer. You had Christensen leave on a free transfer. You had Alonso leave on a free transfer. Miazga left on a free transfer. Clark Salter left on a free transfer. Musonda Jr. left on a free transfer. You had Hudson-Odoi got loaned to Leverkusen. You had Anthony, who was loaned to Spezia. You had Levi Colwell, who had his Brighton loan transfer. You had Slonina, who went back to MLS with Chicago as a part of that deal. And then you had Baba Rockman end up with Reading in the championship. You had Saul's loan that ended. And then you had Ross Barkley and Danny Drinkwater just depart the club. That is quite the list of activity from an outgoing perspective, Sam.
And I also look at that list and I see that Andre Santos was signed and then sent back to Vasco. So I'll just put, incomings there up a notch and say that's pretty good business. But yeah, I mean, from an outgoing perspective, a lot going on. And I'd probably say that when you look at Timo Werner, you look at the Lukaku sort of temporary solution to get him out of the way, job well done. It was required at that moment. Alonso sort of also declining. Rudiger wasn't really in our hands. So largely, I think signings that needed to be done in one capacity or the other. And I think when you look at the costs involved in terms of the loan fees as well as what we received in permanent deals, I don't think the directors or the hierarchy just didn't worry about what it was going to cost. Like you take a small hit, just reduce the squad as much as possible, and then take it from there.
And the one note is Santos was technically in the winter window of 24, not the summer, or sorry, the winter window of 23,
Okay.
not the summer window. So, if we take that out, I think that might change your opinion a little bit on how, maybe not entirely, but a little bit on that overall window grading.
To that point, though,
Okay.
I mean, this was the squad turnover. Like, you're moving out a lot of players who had served a great purpose at Chelsea, but were on whatever, kind of trajectory, and you need to replace them. And that's where we can get into the actual grade itself. Like, how do you guys grade this window? Are you the one of the 7 votes that we got for 4, Sam? Like, how are you feeling about this?
I'd probably be in like 3.5. Like out of the
Wow.
unpredictability of transfers, I'd probably say 3.5. Yeah. I'm saying
Whoa.
this. Look, Nick, I'm going to say that I love this with all my passion. I do this like in terms of trying to pinpoint who the next guy is going to be, whether the transfer is going to work. I put a lot of work into this from a personal perspective, and I've got things wrong for no reason or no fault of mine. It's just the world of transfers. So, in my opinion, it was a good attempt to give Thomas Tuchel what he needed. Um, Experienced signings, trying to get the right profiles for him just didn't work out. So I think intention wise, I'll give them a 3.5. I'm not going to be rude and say, oh, it's easy to say it didn't work out at all and go to a 1 or a 2. But just from an intention perspective, I'll give them the credit that they deserve, especially at such short notice. So 3.5 maybe.
Yeah, I think you'll take up the collective average of Dan and I then, which is, I think we're rating this at a 2. And
Two.
like, I think that the point that like the intentionality was there. They tried to do something big and bold, and it just didn't quite come off. I take that point, and I think that that's a fair assessment. I think we are trying to be fair on this podcast of assessing all of the moves that happened. This was the bully sporting director summer, and so I think you can look at that as well, which is like, didn't have time. I mean, really, like, you didn't know that you were going to win the bid until the transfer window basically opened, right? So like, you were doing the takeover of the club and you had a summer transfer window. Like, even if Michael Edwards was ready on day 1, he still would have had gardening leave at that point. Like, it was a pretty rough summer. I think they did try, but I think the results are the results, and we went into the most perilous year of results for Chelsea Football Club since 2015-16. Dan, I mean, it was just not a good year.
I'm also, the reason I shade my grade is like who's still on this list of incomings is actually a top level contributor to this team and to this side. And like that really guided a lot of my grading on it. And so the fact that you have Mark Cucurella, who at the time, I think there was a lot of opinion around an overpay, even with the Man City interest in him. I think there was some view of like, oh, it's the Brighton level signing. Maybe it's not necessarily the player that pushes us forward. There are still games where he definitely the switch gets flipped off a little bit, and you're getting the opposite of the great Cucurella that you can get at times. But to have one player from that window be around effectively 3 years later feels a little sore in that regard. I mean, I know that I take Sam's point around Wes Fofana being someone who could be a very high level contributor, but has maybe just had a horrific injury record that has kept him out of being one of those individuals that could push the team forward. But the fact that we have had to recorrect so many of the mistakes. Again, you get a little bit of an effort for a college try. You came in very late. The club purchase happening in May did not set us up to have, I think, a phenomenal window in this. So like I think maybe grading on a curve, if you wanted to say like 2.5 or closer to 3, I wouldn't be mad at that rating, because I do think there was a lot of inexperience in the decision making process.
If Fofana was a regular contributor, I could go up to a 3 here, because I think he would be that important. Like, we all know the insane premium that a center back can bring to a team, can bring to a league, frankly. Like, we've seen it happen. But because he's been available for, I think, 30% of the total games that he's had since he's been around, since summer of 22, I think it's I think it's also well within your rights to be, you know, maybe not grading that so high. And I remember how pumped we all were. I mean, when that signing was made, that was like a big old statement of intent. Like Leicester were in top four contention way back then. They didn't want to let him go. Like they were, you know, I think really upset that we played some hardball and really made it happen. That was like a last day of the window sort of signing. I was in London when that happened, and it was like a big statement of intent. And then it was just nothing after that, and it was unfortunate. But you know, we can't. I don't think we can wish cast here either. You know.
All right, well, let's flip forward then to the winter 2023 window. And the listeners generally tended to grade this. One person, 1.4% of the grouping, did give it a 5. There was an even split, though, between the 2 and 3 grading. So 2.5 clearly winning out here, of 35% apiece. 16% gave it a 4, and then 13% gave it a 1. We'll talk about the incomings for that window. And as we mentioned earlier, 121 million euros to secure World Cup winner. Enzo Fernandez, bringing him in off of the back of that performance was, definitely going to be an overpay in some regards for his performance. And then you had Mudryk coming in, 70 million euros. You had Benoit Badiashile, 38 million euros. You had Nani Madueke, 35 million euros. Malo Gusto comes in, but then stays with Lyon till the end of the season for 30 million. Similar move with Andre Santos, 12.5 million euros. David Datro Fofana, 12 million euros. You had Joao Felix come in off of a loan fee of 11 million euros. It's a list, Nick. It's a list.
It's a list. Yeah, I'd fucking say so. I mean, look, I think there are going to be people who disagree with my pass fail on these, and that's okay. I'm at a 2 for the grade, and I think that Enzo has only slightly been a pass, especially when you factor in his fee. I think you look at Mudryk, clear fail. Felix, clear fail. Badiashile at this point is a fail, even though I think he could potentially be a pass. Has not been injured a handful of times, and I just don't know what he is going to become. Madueke, you could argue, because it wasn't that much of a fee, is probably a pass, but maybe just barely. Malo Gusto was a pass, probably based on this year's performances, isn't quite at that category anymore, although I think that was the smartest business at the time. And then you haven't played Andre Santos in your team, despite my longing to have that happen. So you can't really grade that one. It's a panic window. It is we fucked up the summer and we need to go figure out a midfield now because we don't have a midfield that works, and we need to go try and secure some energy and attacking thrust into this team that, you know, under Graham Potter had started well and then got super injured, and we had to go figure out how to plug those holes. And so, you know, I think while this could, you know, eventually maybe the light will shine on this in a more positive way, Sam, I think that it really stuck out to me as like, oh shit, maybe our plan is being thrown out the window here.
Yeah, again, I probably would be quite ambivalent with the signings made. Like I look at some of the guys that I was watching, Badiashile, for example, Madueke I also watched, Enzo I was watching at Benfica. So really, really good players, you know, and especially from an age point perspective, it looked like we'd moved away from those first window signings with the experience and the big wages to a more conservative approach. So obviously you paid over the top for Enzo Fernandez. I think he was more somewhere between like the 65 to 80 million at that point in time. But I think we got Badiashile for a decent fee. I think we got Madueke for a decent fee. Mudryk, oh my god. Um, yeah, it just from that perspective, from Ukraine and how we had to pay in terms of just because the competition there was Arsenal. I think we messed up there. So again, I would probably look at the incomings and say there's a good 3, 4 players there that I really like. I think Gusto was also a very good signing. Like in terms of just one of the more promising right backs in Europe, and we secured him pretty quickly for a very good fee. Andre Santos, who I mentioned earlier. So from that standpoint, I would probably say that again, good decisions on which players to target, but maybe we overpaid for a couple of them. And again, Badia Shield did work out for God knows what reason. I would have put good money on Badia Shield to come good because I saw him at Monaco and he looked phenomenal. And every single club in Europe was after him. He rejected United. PSG were after him. A lot of top clubs are looking at him as the next big centre back. And again, you look at him now and you wonder where that confidence is gone. So probably again between maybe somewhere. I'll probably put three as my decision. Probably being generous here, but somebody has to counteract
I feel like you're. I
all the
feel like what you're.
twos.
I feel like you're doing something though, Sam, that I'm curious about, which is like you're thinking about the intent of the signing versus like how they've actually
Hmm.
worked out. And I suppose
Absolutely.
having both perspectives is good on this show because I think we are trying to put ourselves back into the mind state of like what happened when we were signing these guys.
Hmm.
But I mean, like of that list, key contributors, like guys who have really contributed, Enzo Fernandez, but it hasn't been a smooth ride. Let's just be candid about that. This has not been the transformational midfielder that we thought we were going to get right away. It took quite a ways for him to really bet in. Madueke, but I think there's clear pluses and minuses depending on what system he's being played in and what he's being asked to do. And then Gusto, which is like under Poch better, under Maresca not so much. And like you kind of look at these guys and it's like key contributors, performance, like people who can help us advance. Like it looks like a sexier list than maybe it's actually performed as. Do you agree with that?
But Nick, can I just add? So let me look at this from let me just give you an alternate perspective in terms of how I'm looking. At the age that Madueke is now, which is 22, Mo Salah was at Fiorentina, and his top sort of
Mhm.
record there was 6 goals and 3 assists. And everybody says, "Oh, Madueke has been a flop," but I mean, Salah was called that when he was, moving from Basel to us, and you could see that he was underdeveloped in a lot of areas. Obviously, not every player we sign is going to turn out to be a Mohamed Salah or a Cole Palmer. But in terms of, is he sort of in that zone where you expect him to be at his peak? In my opinion, no. I think by 24, 25, Madueke is probably the player that he projected he would be. So, in terms of an intent to get him early, and to pay the money that you have, which is quite a decent fee on pretty good wages. Did you take an intelligent gamble? In my opinion, yes. So that's the perspective I'm coming with and saying the same with Badia Shield, the same with Madueke. Good decisions. Probably not an Enzo Fernandez because he won a World Cup and he was there for everybody to see. But everybody else I look at and say pretty good.
So let me ask because I think then that brings up a question for me. If we look at the long history of transfers,
Mhm.
I assume because there has to be balance in this perspective as well, and I take that on board. Not every transfer is going to be a hit. Not every transfer is going to be a miss. What is an acceptable hit rate to you on bought a player at whatever fee? Like take fee out of it because you don't control the fee; the market does. But the player actually comes and performs to the level that you anticipated them performing at equals hit versus the opposite being a miss. What's an acceptable hit rate for you percentage wise? Is it 50%? Is it
Wow,
70%?
that's
Is it 30?
that's a
Like,
pretty that's a pretty complicated question in my opinion, Nick, because I think it also depends on like the price that you pay for a player. So, for example, if you're buying Lukaku for 100 million plus, and you suddenly try and play him as a target man, in my opinion, you've made the right signing, but you've absolutely like gone the opposite direction in terms of what you had to do with the signing. You have to figure out like how you're going to play the player. You have to understand that this is going to be a fit in your system. To give you an opinion, Nick, we saw Enzo Fernandez play as a number 8 in the World Cup. We saw him play as a double pivot with Florentino Luis in Benfica. When he joined us for Graham Potter, he played as the deepest midfielder as a number 6. So are you paying 100 million to pay a number 8 as a number 6 is my question. So how do you expect him to succeed when you suddenly change his roles? So is that a fair sort of assessment in terms of this is the percentage I expect him to succeed when he's not playing in ideal parameters? So my answer is no. So, in my opinion, if you've got everything zeroed down in terms of this is how you expect him to fit in your current manager's plans, maybe also if you're lucky, look good in the next 3, 4 years in whatever formation, whatever system, then I'd probably say like an ideal 60% if it gets there is a very, very good hit rate. Very good,
We
but
Yeah.
might be
probably
we
like
might be a
closer to
little off
50.
that 60% then in terms of our
No,
overall
I mean,
performance rating.
I was
No, no,
gonna
yeah, yeah.
say
For
like
us, no. Mhm,
I was gonna say like an acceptable hit rate to me is half because like
mhm,
you're right. There are a ton of circumstantial things that could happen that would adjust whether you think a player is successful or not, whether you think that they've done the right job or not. But I do think when
yeah,
you look at even this window, do we get to half? Do we get to 50%?
mhm,
Maybe just barely, but I don't,
Well,
I don't know.
let's finish out on this one. So the outgoings were selling Jorginho to Arsenal to help make sure that they didn't win the league for 11.3 million. Very
10.
very
It's a 10 then.
positive.
We're good to
You
go.
might consider this window a 5 underneath that
at one
philosophy
point.
there. That's a +1 there on any rating we had. So I rated it a 3. It gets to be a 4 now. Malagustos again, considered a loan. Santos considered a loan, and then we sent Cassidy to Reading for the remainder. I would say, just to kind of cap off on this particular one, kind of with the grading element of it here, you have Enzo who still could be a great contributor for this team if he gets played in a position with others and has the right kind of formation around it. Badiashile, I think again, jury is still a little out on if he can contribute at a high level. He's having some of the recurring injury issues. Mudryk obviously proves, I think, to be the biggest flop of this window, and one of the bigger flops as we talk about best and worst signings under the Clearlake and Winstanley Stewart era of Chelsea Football Club. But then you have some really promising individuals like Andre Santos that you're excited about for the future years here. I know that you, Nick, gave it a 2 as a panic window. Sam also gave it a 3. So in general, we're kind of guiding towards a very high 2 as overall rating.
To be fair, I'm grading both the signings, like because Andre Santos has not played a minute of competitive
Sure.
football for Chelsea, right? I mean, do I think he's going to be great? Sure. Have we seen 1 minute of action yet? No. Uh, and like I'm grading the potential, and I'm grading like what they have done. And that season was just horrific. And this did feel panicky. Like I know that on the surface, some of these names seem like, oh man, there was some really good business done there. The actual performance of these players since this window have been varied. It really has been. And so while I think there is great potential in this window, we'll see.